Welcome to European society in the High Middle Ages, 1200s to 1347. This is Melinda Cole Klein. After the 950s, Western Europe began to enjoy a measure of stability and peace. In the next 100 years, the invasion of Europe by the latest barbarians had declined. This relative peace gave the people, especially settled ones, hope for the future, which led to a rise in agricultural production and trade. While the growth of the population would continue, two factors led to expansion of European civilization. Number one, political order, and number two, safety and security offered by a military social class. Manorialism involved the services by the peasant class. Feudalism concerned the rights, powers, and lifestyles of the military elite. The two were linked because the landed warrior class depended on the labor of the peasants to work their estates. Peasants needed protection in exchange for rents, labor, and other services. When the peasants became a permanent part of the lord's labor force, he was called a serf, unable to leave the manor without the lord of the manor's consent. During the early Middle Ages, Europe had a relatively small population, but this changed. By the mid-1200s, the number of people had doubled from 38 to 74 million. What accounted for this tremendous increase? By the 1100s, Europeans began to farm in new ways, and it was warmer since the 800s, allowing for more sunlight and a longer growing season. Historians generally agree the period of this warming trend was between 800s and 1300, and this contributed to agricultural production. This feature of medieval life led to a population boom. Farming peasants by the 1000s had transformed forests and marshes into productive farms. They drained swamps, following the lead of monks. Thus, by the 1200s, there was more land under the plow by free peasants. All the while, raiding pagans had adopted settled livelihoods after becoming Christian. Secondly, there were technological advances that produced labor-saving devices. Iron was used for hammers, nails, axes, hoes, and plows, pulled by a team of horses or oxen with the advent of the horse collar. Thus, Europeans incorporated horsepower, wind power, and water power to grind grain, for example, into flour. This saved multiple man-hours with these activities on the farm, replaced by labor-saving devices. Continental Europe and England has many river systems, so harnessing water power made good economic sense. Across the Netherlands, the harnessing of wind power became a labor-saving means of power as well. Third, there was a major change in planting. When a shift from the two-field system used since 5000 BC to the three-field system in regards to crop rotation, and this technology took hold, food production increased. One field was planted in the fall for winter grains, such as rye or wheat. A second field was planted in the spring, growing oats, barley, peas, vegetables, and legumes. A third field was to lie fallow, thus returning to its natural state. Farm animals grazed on these fallow lands, dropping their manure as they went, and this fertilized plots. This kept the soil from becoming exhausted. The ability to feed one's family and create a surplus was critical to paying taxes and selling products in town markets. A surplus economy enabled producers to purchase goods from other sources, such as shoes from cobblers and metal tools from people who made them. Medieval Western Europe was by far an agrarian society, with most of the people living in small villages. Their homes were made of wood frame plaster made over clay. Roofs were thatched. Medieval homes were cold, damp, and dark. Sometimes it was warmer and lighter outside the home than within its walls. Many peasant families ate, slept, and spent time together in very small quarters, approximating 1 to 2 rooms. The medieval diet was adequate and varied in its food types by regions. Archaeological records of family consumption indicates enjoyment of music and song, eating of meat such as chicken and pork, use of eating utensils, and possession of slaughtering tools. But stability of calories and protein, thus offering much needed daily vitamins, depended on the production of grains. Grains are easily stored, and when processed into peasant bread, this multi-grain loaf was nutritious. It came in 2 forms, baked or pan-fried. Both of these were edible. When fermented, it became known as liquid bread or unfiltered beer. Villages and manor estates usually had communal ovens to bake bread. Peasant bread was richly nutritious. The medieval diet was supplemented with the following: beer and/or ale, because until recently water was unsafe to drink. This was at every meal or between meals. As far as quantities, this was several pints a day, or up to 1 gallon per person, children and adults, a common practice in Western society until the mid-19th century. Beer takes on the identity of liquid bread from this time forward, since it is grain-based, a good source of valuable vitamins and calories. Next would be cow cheese and milk, if fresh, otherwise it was unstable. And then there was also goat cheeses, nuts, and berries. Next would be vegetables. Also in France and England there were fruits, especially apples and pears. And Spain was known for its citrus products. The final 3 categories belongs to meat. Chickens provided eggs and also feathers for beds and pillows. And this also was tied to geese as well if they were kept. Red meat once or twice a year, usually served on feast days or weddings. And then pork products were a few times a year as well. Gradually, trade and commerce made it back to European towns with the emergence of free artisans and craftspeople not tied to the land. By the 1200s, Italian merchants had trade posts in Cairo, Damascus, and a number of Black Sea ports where they acquired goods brought by Muslim merchants from faraway India, China, and the South Sea Islands of what is today Indonesia. Asian goods since ancient times were luxury items. These included silks, spices, porcelain, gunpowder, innovations in technology, paper, and food products such as peaches and oranges. Northern Europeans produced in the late Middle Ages high-quality woolen cloth, rivaling silk, but it was woolen cloth nonetheless. Northern Europe became an ideal trade center. As trade increased, gold and silver replaced the euro barter system of trade in goods for kind. In time, there would be banking firms and the foundation built for commercial capitalism. These economic developments led to the repopulation of cities. By the 1100s, old Roman trade cities were repopulated and revived, with commercial activities becoming politically and economically important over time. Many trade centers of the Middle Ages were near a castle or a monastery. City people, while they wanted protection from raids and bandits, did not have the same relationship to their local lord as did the serfs that worked the land. These free borough merchants, or bourgeoisie, in more modern terms a middle class, wrote their own laws that demanded their independence to buy or sell property in exchange for paying taxes. Private enterprise enabled lowly tradesmen to broaden their endeavors, which led to increased wealth. This time reflects a turn to capitalism west of Greece and the Byzantine Empire. As mentioned, a peasant diet was varied in fruits, grains, eggs, cheese, and beer. The water was unsafe to drink as it was often contaminated from pollution. This pollution created sickness and death. Medieval beer contained little alcohol and was a favorite beverage, often made at home. Unfiltered and porridge-like, thus it was called liquid bread. Beer was standard fare in Western diets from breakfast to dinner until the early 20th century as water quality improved. Before public sanitation, cholera and typhoid were a significant cause of death in urban neighborhoods and town centers due to unclean water. Other aspects of peasant life included time off from work for feast days. The Catholic Church held communal events to celebrate faith and individual spirituality associated with Christianity. 3 great feast days in which peasants did not labor were Christmas, Easter, and the Pentecost. There were many other times associated with saints and the Virgin Mary. People celebrated and made feast days of their own, with family and church rituals such as marriage, births, and deaths. Households were generally regulated by births, deaths, and disease, conflict, and also injury. With the more children and relatives, a farm could function better as household labor was cheaper and better managed by the adult male whose authority was law. Men often sat when they ate at a table, while women stood, and male children were allowed to sit as well. This was a hierarchical society and culture. Peasants often made use of farm animals for use outside of their labor and milk products. Large farm animals such as cows, horses, sheep, and oxen give off a tremendous amount of body heat. Barn-type structures with living above or adjoined to animal shelters provide heat. This also provided security for peasants from roaming bandits looking to steal their animals from the fields. In addition, close living quarters of Western peoples with their animals meant microbes and disease, including resistances, passed from animals to humans more easily. Medieval law and justice evolved from 2 sources that became common law practiced in Europe. These were the legacies of Roman laws promoted to society by the Christian Church. The effects of German barbarians migrating and spreading across Europe their traditions of maintaining law and order, So these were the two types that converged as one. These two judicial systems created local to royal courts throughout Europe. Medieval law came to require an accused to prove his or her innocence. The following are 3 ways in which this was done. Number 1, comburgation. This meant that a person accused of a crime was required to swear an oath of innocence, and depending on the seriousness of the offense, might be required to persuade members of his or her extended family to make an oath as well, which seems similar to bearing witness. However, it was different because if the accused was found guilty, all liable parties were subject to punishment. The second type was the practice of ordeals. The accused, lacking anyone to back up his story of innocence, might be required to undergo a variety of ordeals. These were physical tests to prove his or her innocence. Such ordeals included cold water. The defendant was bound hand and foot and thrown in a pool of water that had been previously blessed by a priest. On the belief that holy water would reject a liar who had offered a holy oath before the ordeal, it was believed that the guilty would float. God rejected the liar from the pond, blessed, thus holy. And the innocent would sink. God would accept the innocent. Yes, there were assistants to rescue the successfully drowning individual, if at all possible, but this, of course, was not always possible. All right, number 3 is trial by combat or trial by battle, as it's remembered. Believing that God would not allow the guilty to prosper, important matters were often settled by physical combat. The plaintiff and defendant did not leave court to fight in a separate place and time, but were allowed to choose champions to fight for them if they could afford it. This method was an important element of civil law and persisted as dueling until modern times. In regards to village policing, there were respectable members of the village who were required to raise hue and cry. This is to make a noise and tell someone important a crime was committed, or tell who did it, get the guilty arrested, and restore law and order. That's called hue and cry. The intention was to get the guilty punished. If a town resident resisted discovery or harbored the guilty or did nothing, they could be punished for direct knowledge of crimes or persons committing crimes or not taking action. There were 3 types of medieval courts. Number 1, these were the ecclesiastical courts. They were the church courts, presided over by a bishop or deacons, monks, and or nuns. The judges could not sentence the guilty to death. They tended to be more lenient or mild in their punishments, and they showed mercy. The cases were typically sins against God, such as fornication, marriage issues, and foul language or abuse. Number 2, these were the manor courts. More often than not, these court cases involved property issues and public drunkenness, assault, theft, or other small or petty crimes. Villagers decided on innocence with jury-like trials with witnesses. Punishments at the manor courts could result in heavy fines or public humiliation. These courts were held in a village-like meeting session, usually in a tavern, presided over by the local lord. Now the 3rd type were the royal courts, and these were presided over by a king or other royal. Punishments could be execution for murderers, rapists, for poaching game, cutting down trees from royal forests, treason against the state, or burglary. These were capital crimes and considered heinous. It was called common law because medieval laws were intended to be the same across the entire kingdom. But your rank in society based on wealth and or position of importance affected how you would be punished. So punishments varied depending on who you were. Fines were common depending on the amount of wealth that you had. With the revival of trade, former Roman cities began to be repopulated as indicated earlier. Medieval artisans and merchants created and bought and sold luxury and practical goods for the society in general, and nobles for reasons of profit. With increased populations in towns combined with improper disposal of human and other decomposing wastes, pollution resulted, affecting the health of the town. Medieval cities were fortified fort-type enclosures, usually built with high stone walls and gates set at intervals. Thus, space, in time with continued population growth, would reach a premium. Streets were narrow and dark. Housing was not built in an organized fashion regulated by city codes. These structures were typically made of wood, making them especially susceptible to fire, a great danger and a frequent event in medieval towns. Living in medieval times was not pleasant. Towns exhibited strong smells from filth rotting in piles and human waste in the street or alongside entry doors. With no city government garbage services, it would be the job of criminals as community service or volunteers to remove garbage and waste from within the city walls. In a city, the water table is the first system at risk of pollution. The processing of leather, for example, put blood, hair, animal fat, tanning acids, and these of course combined, into the groundwater to flush them away. Because of this and other factors, drinking town water was not done. Fresh water came at high prices, purchased from merchants venturing to distant wells, well outside of the city walls. Some Roman aqueducts were still functioning, and there's a few of these that are still functioning today. This system helped bring in fresh water to cities over long distances. While public bathhouses existed in some medieval cities, these public houses were known for prostitution, sin, and vice. When the Great Plague hit in 1347, European bathhouses closed permanently, leading to the post-plague Europeans would live their lives that were extremely dirty. Europeans in the 1300s associated taking a full bath, this means with no clothes on, putting all your body parts in the water all at once. They considered this practice as associated with death. This bathing practice by Europeans would not completely turn around again, and bathing advocated across societies until the 19th century. In town and village shops, youths for centuries began a tradition that still continues across most of Europe today, while it declined in America from the 1820s. This practice we call apprenticeship and training. While master guildsmen and fathers taught their apprenticing sons, and sometimes daughters, how to become craftsmen themselves, quality control developed over time in medieval Europe. while it did not later in colonial America. By the 11th century, guilds, or privately organized members of society in a town or region, maintained standards. This led, over time, to limiting access to certain kinds of jobs because standards had to be certified by the local guild, which wielded considerable power and authority in commercial cities, such as Venice, Milan, Paris, and also London. Training was based on the accumulation of skills, yes, over a period of years, but it also depended on the associations made, such as being bound to a respectable or not so respectable master. A poorly managed apprentice could have long-term repercussions. At the end of a decade of training, the apprentice was awarded the status of journeyman. He could work for wages with another master or open his own shop, becoming master of his own trade and destiny.